Are we good? Yeah, there we are.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just back up a little and say I'm introducing Tracey Dawson, who is the pastor of the Parker Hilltop Church, United Church of Christ in Parker, Colorado, just outside of Denver. And I'm going to ask her to introduce herself, and then I'm going to ask her a couple of questions leading into a case study that she will present. So, Tracey, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for inviting me to this important conversation about just Jesus or a just Jesus. Like many of you, I had a prior vocation. I have been a practicing attorney for 37 years now, and for 33 of those years, I was a criminal court judge. I was led into ministry through a dream, which was kind of wild, but as I got into seminary and began to understand what this sense of call was, I saw that they were really parallel vocations, actually, ministry and my work on the bench. And what I have developed from that is not only a pastoral ministry, because I am the full-time pastor of a medium small church in Parker, Colorado, but I also head up the Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Church of Christ team on healthy ministry relationships, which you might know as boundaries and boundary training. Excuse me. And my interest in coming here today is to help you all see how a healthy ministry relationship starts from the power that you have in the pulpit, and power with rather than power over, especially in times of political turmoil or political fantasy as we are in right now. So that's why I was happy to help Richard out with this seminar, this workshop today, and with the case study that might demonstrate that.
Good. The first question is something that floats around, a term called purple church, purple state, purple this, purple that. We may also all have ideas about what that is. Can you tell me how you've interpreted the idea of what a purple church is?
Sure. A purple church is a church where there are at least two major political parties represented within the church, Democrat and Republican. So blue and red, or red and blue. And a purple church is one that tries to mediate this political climate such that they can still be the beloved community within the confines of the church environment without isolating people or having people feel like they're not welcome, or they have to withdraw, or they have to leave the church altogether because the politics just aren't right. The culture of the church just doesn't fit them anymore. So it's a fine line to walk, but I do believe that by making the church into a Sabbath space, you can walk that line pretty effectively.
Yeah.
And keep information open.
Yeah. See, how did you come to this idea of a Sabbath space for the congregational culture?
We had a policy decision that was probably unspoken before 2016, but definitely spoken after that election, that the church would be a place where we would keep politics out. So I don't preach politics from the pulpit ever. However, that doesn't mean that you can't preach on political topics and you can't be relevant. I try to be relevant, but I keep politics out of things. For example, last week after the election, I'm sure many of you had to preach, and it was a difficult week to preach. I used to think that Mother's Day was the hardest day to preach. Maybe the day after the election is even worse. But what I did was take a movie that some of you may know called The Gods Must Be Crazy. And in that movie, there is a tribe of Bushmen that are living in perfect peace and harmony until a crop duster pilot flying overhead throws out an empty Coke bottle into their compound. They don't know what the Coke bottle is. And at first, it's a wonderful thing to talk about, and it's very entertaining. And they use it as a tool and an art object. But then it starts getting to be an object of power. And there's jealousy that erupts, and there's stealing, and there's even a child that gets hit over the head with the bottle. And so the head of the tribe decides to take the bottle, and first he tries to throw it up into the air to get rid of it, to send it back to the gods, and it just keeps bonking down on their heads. So then he decides to take it and throw it off the end of the earth. And what I did last week was say that love him or hate him, Donald Trump is the Coke bottle that has been dropped into our tribe. And it has been the mirror to hold up to our society to see what our issues are, what our problems are, what our challenges are. And what that did was inspire a conversation after the service was over. We do our services live on Zoom, and then we have a sermon talk back. We had a very lively discussion, not political, but very lively about that mirror image, that metaphor, and the metaphor of the Coke bottle. So by using metaphor to present political topics without being political, we keep our church what we call a Sabbath space, where everyone can just get away from the ads, get away from the politics, get away from the advocacy, and really study their faith and really think about how their faith calls them to be in these times that are so confusing and disorienting.
Well, I know that you have been reading, I think, Wes's book, A Homiletic of All Believers. And in it, he talks about the language. How do we employ theological language in these conversations? You said that in the talk back and in other conversations, talking about one's faith, how does theological thinking happen in those conversations about faith?
It happens in the same way, I think, that Jesus brought them forward. You know, Jesus asked, 306 questions and only answered 3. So I have found that the most useful way to approach these topics without being political is rhetorically, by asking the questions and asking questions. How does this intersect with your faith? How does this make us a stronger and healthier beloved community? And how can you take the unconditional love of God out into the world? And those are the questions that are always in front of the parishioners.
Do you ever have an occasion in your pastoral work where somebody comes to you and says, I just can't go with that opinion, or I'm not getting it. I don't understand where we're going with this. Does any of that sound familiar?
Sure. It happened after the 2016 election that there were a few people that were very upset that our church wasn't declaring itself to be, in this case, well, actually, I had both sides come at me. So, someone said we should be an all blue church, or we should be an all red church. And there's other places that people can go if they don't agree with us. But, and some of those people actually had to move to a different place because we are decidedly purple. I'm sorry, I have a cold. We are decidedly purple. And so one of the techniques that I used after that started to happen was just to not take the bait, to not try to respond one-on-one to those types of comments, but to bring them to the church as a whole body in the preaching, and reminding that we were this Sabbath space and beloved community, beloved purple community. Most people stayed, and the ones that leave, I think you just have to say, if this is really where your faith is calling you, bless you on your journey, and good luck. You just can't go with wherever the wind blows you at any time.
So when something happens, like in the news where the killing of George Floyd, or Breonna Taylor, or what kind of reverberations go through the congregation about that, and how does prayer happen? I mean, what do you pray for in that situation? How do you respond as a Sabbath congregation?
This is perhaps a little unique for me, but maybe there are other ways that you can intersect it in your own lives and ministries. But as a former criminal court judge, it gives me a platform to talk about how it's important not to rush to judgment. It's important to look at all sides of issues. It is important to realize that these are individuals and human beings that are in this situation and that are full of problems and challenges of their own. So instead of coming out over the top, calling for defunding all police departments, or conversely calling for law and order, I instead might tell a story in that situation from my background.
Mm.
I might find a film or a movie that can talk about something in a related way that brings the same sort of questions to the congregation so that they can kind of resolve those things on their own. What I don't want to be, Richard, is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
I left a church that I grew up in because I was said that if there was a volcano that erupted in the middle of Denver, the night before, my pastor would have gone ahead and preached on whatever he was going to preach on. So I want to be relevant, but I want to make sure to understand and to model that there are many different ways to look at these situations. Even in this past election, I've heard in the past couple of weeks at my church, well, 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. How could that happen? Or conversely, the other way for Biden. And, just to bring to them saying, it's not all about personalities. There are important issues that people care about on both sides. Let's not rush to judgment here. Let's talk about these issues and what the mirror is that has been held up to our country. And that allows room, I think, for people to talk from I statements. I feel, I think this makes me feel this way when I hear something, instead of you need to do this way and you need to believe this and you need to vote this way, which is what I see some ministers doing.
I'd like for you to say a bit more about the films that generate conversations and how that helps you. You've given one illustration about Gods Must Be Crazy. What other films have you used, and what's the content of the conversation, and how excuse me, and how that, I'm catching your cold, and how does that nurture your preaching ministry?
I think it's in the same way that you approach things, Richard. And of course, I learned this from you because Richard teaches storytelling. And it's through stories that people can find relatable stories of their own and stories in scripture. So, for instance, earlier this year, I showed the movie Brooklyn, which is about set in the 1950s. It's a young girl that immigrates to the United States from Ireland and learns the American way, and then is torn between both nations and her home and her people in both places. And this was a good way to talk about immigration without talking about the immigration issue. Another time I showed Peanut Butter Falcon, which is about a young boy with Down syndrome who has aspirations to be a pro wrestler. And that was so I could talk about ableism without singling anyone out and calling anyone out about what we are doing or not doing as a church to truly make ourselves accessible and welcoming to all. So it may be through movies, other people may use books. I don't have time to read a whole lot of books, but I can watch a movie in 2 hours and find metaphors and ways to relate it that way. And it also helps connect our community, especially in these COVID times when we're all inside. I show the movies on Friday nights, have a license to stream them, and then I preach about them on Sunday. And then right afterwards, we have this sermon and movie talk back that allows the beloved community to have a voice. I think one of the problems you have in a purple church is if you have no avenue for people to have a voice other than the accusatory voice, the pouting voice, the angry voice. If you don't give any type of platform for people to have a conversational voice, which is I think what Wes Allen's talking about in the book, Richard, then you're missing out on a huge opportunity for faith development in your church.
Yes, and a sermon as monologue all the time. Now, I want to be clear that what Wes is talking about is not necessarily having sort of sermon by community. The preacher is in the pulpit, as you say, and as being in the pulpit gives the sermon, but there might be these conversations around that are going on in the congregation, like around a movie, that allows people to respond to, shall we say, indirect communication. So I just want to be clear. So you don't have a talk back after the movie on Friday night. That happens. It's integrated with the sermon response.
Right, I defer that talk back. We get on after the movie and say, oh, I like that movie, or I didn't like that movie, or I'm really interested in this theme or that. But we save it until after the church service, and the church service is a cohesive whole that relates to whatever the issues are in the movie. This Friday, I'm going to show the old movie Hoosiers that was in 2000, and the theme in Hoosiers is redemption and second chances. So I'm going to be talking about the second chances that we might be able to give our family members who we have disinvited from our dinner tables and our Zoom calls. So it's just a way to get at those topics without being so in your face.
I saw a question by Tom on the chat. I didn't get the whole question, but is the talk back in small groups, or where is that? Well, the sermon talk back, I imagine. How does that happen in a I know, but you should probably tell them.
Yes, because Richard was the subject of that for 2 weeks while I was on sabbatical. There's usually, I usually have about 70 to 80 people on our live service, and probably half of them stay afterwards for the talk back. I haven't felt the need to break into small groups so far. We spend about an hour, and I'm pretty good at making sure everyone has a voice within that time. So I do it as a cohesive whole.
Yes, and speaking from experience, there's real energy around responding, and it really has the quality of exploring the sermon further rather than a debate. People are free to say, I never thought of it that way before, or I've never considered that other possibility, or I've had a hard time with this passage myself, or, it's an enlivening conversation rather than I have to be in a defensive posture. lots of questions of clarification was my experience twice with that group.
And it's a healing opportunity, I think. Last week, a woman who Richard knows, her name is Shirley, she had voted for President Trump, and she was very adamant in her vote. She was very angry after the election and didn't know that whether or not she wanted to come to church, but she came, she watched the movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. She came to church, she listened to the sermon. She listened to much of the sermon talk back, and then she weighed in and she said, you know what, I'm not angry anymore. I really understand this in a new light. And I understand that you all love me and you want me in this conversation. And I really understand this metaphor so much better about holding a mirror up to our society. Thank you. And then she sent me yesterday a long email thanking me again. So that's the type of, we've all had those experiences. Maybe they're far and few between, but we've had those gratifying experiences where what you do does matter. And how you go about it even matters more, I think.
Well, I want to give us some time to explore the case study that you have for us, Tracey. Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up this part of our of our conversation?
No, I think it might be a really good opportunity for people to have a chance to talk about these images and to talk about them in terms of a story that I think we can all relate to. So
okay.
I am allowed to share the screen. I can put the case study up for us.
And we can stop the recording if need be, but we can go on if that's easier.
Probably should stop it because we're going to go into small groups.
I'll let you present the case study and then I'll stop it.
Okay. All right, sounds great. This is a program called Beautiful.ai, and is an example of a way that you can enliven your worship service through imagery. And it's like PowerPoint, but PowerPoint on steroids. I have fallen in love with this particular program.
This is the same case study that was distributed to some, but not all have probably had a chance to read it. So we're presenting it in this way.
Okay, so let me just read the case study first, and then I'll set it up a little bit, and then we'll break you into small groups to discuss some questions. The senior pastor of a church feels strongly that the United States should not back out of the Paris Agreement. She thinks climate change is the most important issue facing the world. Many parishioners agree with her, but others do not, believing that the world is doing what it does. They feel that weather patterns ebb and flow with the years, and there are far more serious issues facing our country, like immigration, the pandemic, and rioting in the cities. The pastor plans her Earth Day sermon with an ask at the end that congregants vote and advocate support of the Paris Agreement and America's participation in it. Some members of the church are highly offended by her sermon and feel bullied by their pastor. The pastor responds that she needs to preach as she feels called, that God has been very clear with her on this matter, and that those who feel otherwise need to pray hard and examine their own biases. So this idea of power from the pulpit is power with versus power over. And we are sometimes called to a particular issue that we feel is the most important issue in the world. And when that happens, I think we can get blinders on that our ego and our needs are not necessarily the needs of the whole church. And if we come off like bullies, we are not going to inspire people to feel like they are beloved community and that they can talk and that they can discuss the issue. They are automatically put on the defensive. And that's not what we want to be about, I think, as pastors. We want to invite people into the conversation, not move them away from the conversation. So if you think of it in theological terms, or just Jesus would what? Tell a story, a parable, or ask a question, rather than take a bully pulpit and tell people what they should do, or what they should think, or how they should interpret the story. So those stories can be so much more beneficial to keeping that conversation open. All right, so here's the questions that we have that will put you in these small groups. And I can broadcast these questions as we go. There's a lot of people on this Zoom, so it's going to be a little slow moving them along. Okay. What do you think of the pastor's decision to preach on and advocate her position on a contested social issue? That's one question. How has the pastor made room or not made room for the other voices, including the leading of the Holy Spirit? And how could this subject be handled in the direction of truth and love, such that people in the church do not feel bullied, but are free to respectfully express an opposite opinion? So that's the case study that Richard and I developed